And yeah, if you haven't been before, welcome to Cubitt. Thanks for joining this in conversation with Gordon Hall, who I'm delighted to welcome today for this event, which forms part of the extended programme for Mathew Wayne Parkin's new commission, I Can Fit a Fist in My Mouth, which we're all currently sat within. And Matthew's also joining us here today, but I won't make them stand up and wave unless they really want to. Out of the corner of my eye, I sense the answer is no. I'm Seán. I'm the curatorial fellow here at Cubitt, and this exhibition is part of a wider programme that I've been developing called Feeling Still in a World Which Runs, which supports new commissions by 4 artists from across the UK, Mathew being one of them, as well as Kirsty Russell, who's based in Aberdeen, Marlene Smith, who's based in Birmingham, and Nicola Singh, who's based in Greater Manchester. As well as a previous exhibition of existing film work, which was called Two Films About Love, which included films by Moad El Salem and Anne-Marie Copestake. I'm going to briefly introduce Gordon, and then I'm going to sort of talk about like the structure for today. So we've got a few questions with some sort of theoretical plot points, but there's going to be opportunities to ask Gordon things if you'd like at the end, or heckle or harass or whatever you see fit. Hopefully not.
Hopefully they can ask you things.
Yeah. Gordon Hall is an artist whose work encompasses sculpture, performance, and writing. Their sculptures emerge from the world of furniture and are often put to use by performing bodies who test out possible uses for Hall's ambiguously functional objects. Gordon Hall's interdisciplinary practice explores our practices of looking, requesting forms of care and attention that exceed conventional forms of legibility. Hall has presented solo exhibitions at EMPAC, Foxy Production, Temple Contemporary, the Renaissance Society, MIT List Visual Arts Centre, Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, and many others. Hall's sculptures and performances have been exhibited in a variety of group settings, including the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Sculpture Center, Movement Research, Brooklyn Museum, White Columns, the Whitney, Hessel Museum, Wising Art Center, which is slightly more local to us, Abrons Art Center, Socrates Sculpture Park, and the Drawing Center. So, yeah, welcome, Gordon. It's nice to have you in the UK. And if you haven't worked it out already, we have these images behind, which we thought was like a nicer way of developing like familiarity for you all who might not know Gordon's work as well, rather than going through each individual one and talking about them. So I'll just briefly talk about like the structure for today. We're going to start by kind of talking about some of the terms that we're using, and if you want to ask questions or like clarification, just put your hand up and I'll try to get to you. But I think a really important anchor that Gordon and I were talking about for this talk was weak theory, which was sort of developed by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Lauren Berlant, and Kathleen Turner. And Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's sort of understanding of weak theory is that it sits in contrast to hegemonic strong theories, and these are traditional strong theories being theories that attempt to sort of consolidate things into a definable and like finite worldview in a way. And weak theory instead is one that prioritizes the effective, the intimate, and unstable forms of knowledge, and that's why it's become particularly useful in a lot of like feminist and queer thinking. It allows for unresolvedness and questions that lead to questions, and this felt really pertinent as a key reference within my program. Is the work of Annie Ernaux, which the title of my program, Feeling Still in a World Which Runs, is a personal translation of a passage from her seminal book, The Years. Whoever did the translation for Fitzcarraldo editions translated it differently. I think mine's better, but it's fine. But it comes from se sentir immobile dans un monde qui court, so feeling still in a world which runs, and sort of sort of situating yourself within time's passage around you and connecting to histories and affects through that. All of these ideas are sort of hanging in the air right now, but to bring it back to the room, it was really this idea of like an uncertainty and an ability to escape definition and therefore capture and legibility was what made me think of an imaginary dialogue between Mathew's practice and Gordon's. It's maybe a bit odd to have like an artist doing in conversation in the context of someone else's exhibition, but that's kind of part of my hope for the program, is that it can expand on relations between practices and people. And in Mathew's film, there's sort of an abstraction of intimacy, and there's a privileging of the materiality of language and the voice in engaging attempts to represent something that's unseen. And in this way, I think that Parkin's work, and this new work in particular, sort of operates out with an infrastructure of institutional subjectivity, and that made me want to talk to Gordon about unresolvedness, the promise of objecthood instead of subjecthood, and evasion more generally. So I want to begin by asking Gordon a first question, which is about the tricky position of beauty in their practice, and how affection and imagining relates such ideas of beauty to the possibility of a politic or an ethic or political action. So,
Thank you. If any of the folks in the back are wanting to be closer, there are some seats right here if you want to come up. Before I speak to, the question about beauty, I just want to respond to a couple of points in the beautiful introduction you just gave. One is that as a curatorial framing, I really appreciate the idea that an artist's work would sort of function as a place of gathering for other artists' work. And I think that is quite, somewhat opposed to a kind of curatorial model that's very much about the kind of elevation of the individual artist. So I really like to think, of my own practice as like, it's a gathering of all the things that relate to it or that fuel it. And so I like very much to be here, in that way. The concept of weak theory, for me, primarily through Sedgwick's lens, has been really, really useful as a way of figuring out, as a tool for figuring out like what my practice is all about. And one of the ways that it's been useful is it helped me to get away from the idea that art is always expressive of a stable position, either subject position or a stable set of ideas. Like art is expressive of who you are and what you think. That's true to some degree, and I think there's artists who use that methodology like to great effect. But for me, it feels more like art is what you do as you try to become different than you are, actually. It's a process of asking questions and changing, or like trying to articulate not what you even do believe, but like what you hope to believe, sort of like as a way of getting to that, from here to there. So I'm just going to sort of name that. But yeah. I brought with me one of my very favorite takes on the question of beauty in art, because it's such a hard and big question. So this is Felix Gonzalez Torres in an interview from 1995. He says, "But as we know, aesthetics are politics. They're not even about politics, they are politics. Because you ask who is defining aesthetics, you realize quickly again that the most effective ideological constructions are the ones that don't look like it. If you say, I'm political, I'm ideological, that's not going to work because people know where you are coming from. But if you say, hi, my name is Bob and this is it, and then they say, that's not political. It's invisible and it really works. I think certain elements of beauty used to attract the viewer are indispensable. So that last idea, that beauty is a way to enter a world of ideas through an embodied relationship with an object, I think is really important and compelling. But then this first thing he says, aesthetics or politics, so, what we even find beautiful, I mean, it's extremely hard to, articulate what that is or to try to figure out how to make something that does that. But we can say that it's not a stable category, right? It's what we find beautiful changes as our politics change. And especially as we digest what we think, there's what we think, and then there's what we really, have internalized, and that changes everything about how you view the world, including what kinds of objects, people, experiences, produce the effect of beauty.
Yeah, I think there's something about that relationship between, I think beauty and aesthetics, Felix really nailed that, just describing it, that really intimate relationship between politics and beauty. And I think it's interesting to think about, I think the relationship between beauty and politics kind of upends when you try and apply sort of linear temporality to it. There is a point at which politics can inform what we find beautiful, and in the same way, Jennifer C. Nash writes in a really great essay called Defining Writing Black Beauty, sort of talks about the need for beauty, particularly in oppressed people's cultural production, the need for beauty to exist because it then creates an effective momentum for political change to emerge from that. So I think this beauty in politics, we'd be tempted to think of that as a dyad, as the one thing informing the other, or vice versa. But actually, as soon as you try and apply this linear temporality to that, it just fucks it up, because there's so many different ways to think about that. And yeah, I wanted to read a little bit about sort of conventions, and you work within a visual vocabulary that you yourself situate in relation to or understand within sort of a wider understanding of minimalist sculpture. And there's a portion of this essay where Jennifer Nash says, beautiful theoretical writing is often staged as an antidote to both conventional academic writing and to conventional conceptions of archives. As Christina Sharp writes, despite knowing otherwise, we are often disciplined into thinking through and along lines that reinscribe our own annihilation, reinforcing and reproducing what Sylvia Wynter has called our narratively condemned status. What if, Sharp asks, we insisted on what we know? What if we refused forms of thinking, writing, and disciplinarity that produce our annihilation? So I think there's something about that. What does it mean for you to be working within in a way, quite masculine history of sculpture, and engaging with those conventions? And what do you think the opportunity for invoking different types of beauty within that cadre means?
Yeah. I'm just laughing because I teach sculpture to undergrads, and I'm the only person at the institution I work at who teaches sculpture, so they don't have any idea what a sculpture bro is because they've never met one.
They're so lucky.
And I don't even have any in my classes.
Oh my God.
I hardly ever have a cisgender man in any of my classes. Anyway, so I've made this sculpture shop. This is kind of a queer feminist utopia. It makes me really happy. Because I came to sculpture not through drawing and painting. I came through dance. So I was making dances, and then the dances had costumes and props that got more and more and more complicated until finally there was know people sometimes, and then I was like, it's sculpture. And meanwhile, like let my dance training go. So that was the door in. But then the thing that really made me stay was the way that sculpture, I think looking at it, but I think to a heightened degree making it, like forces you into a really intimate relationship with the physical world. And it's an intimate relationship that's sometimes very like lovely, beautiful, sensual, erotic, whatever. But it's also an intimate relationship that's can be really maddening, frustrating. I work with concrete a lot, as you can see. Like that sculpture that just passed weighs collectively like 1,200 pounds or something. So no part of it, except for like that little triangle on the top, can I pick up myself and move. And so it's putting you into this like quite unempowered, potentially we could describe it that way, position where you are highly reliant on other people and tools to help you. Plus, this is actually a good example too. A lot of these take like 3 or 4 tries to like get it right. So the amount of sort of like time and labor and crying and frustration to like get an object to arrive in this state where it just seems like, yeah, that's exactly what that looks like, you know. So that's, you know, dance was the door, but that kind of intimacy with materiality was really like what helped me stay. And then I can't account for exactly why I love minimal sculpture so much, and not all the minimalists are the same. They're so different.
Hashtag not all minimalists.
Kind of, yeah. Like, Donald Judd means kind of nothing to me. Robert Morris means very little to me, except for all the works that are just taken from Simone Forti. But then there's people like Anne Truitt, Beverly Buchanan, John McCracken, Fred Sandback. You know, it's sort of like the B-side minimalist. But anyway, so we could go down a hole of trying to parse out the differences. And there's a critique there of like how art history is written more along formal similarities than conceptual commitments or political commitments. But so I couldn't explain why I really loved this artwork. You know, like you cry in the museum. Andrea Fraser's essay, Why Does Fred Sandback's Work Make Me Cry? Yeah. I'm like, oh, that's me, yeah. But then I was like, I'm not supposed to like this art because this is not feminist. It's not queer. It like can't deal with difference. This isn't the art I'm supposed to be liking. And so I sort of went down this, I mean, now it feels like this like 20-year project of trying to figure out ways to reclaim a kind of reductive visual language towards different kinds of ends. And one of the main ways that I've both written about and talked about, but also like try to do, is to think about the sort of refusal of legibility or the refusal of like the demands for transparency that can come with making work that's very quiet, still, like simple. I mean, none of it's actually that simple, but it appears to be quite, you know, usually it's one material, it's very symmetrical, things like that. And so I really think about abstraction as potentially like a form of refusal. And also as sort of a way of speaking to that which we don't at the present moment have the tools to speak. So speaking to like a future time where we'll be able to say something that we now don't even have the tools to say.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about that, what you were saying about, I think material intimacy is such a like broad and it's such a broad sort of concept to think about that it could take us in like so many directions. But I wanted to ask about, you know, you talked about coming to sculpture from dance rather than coming to sculpture from sculpture. And yeah, I wanted to talk about like surfaces in the work and like, I guess surfaces and the points at which they like interface with one another. And, you know, I spent all of last night trying to find this reference and can't fucking find it. So I'm very sorry to whoever I'm like not citing here, but I remember...
it's weak theory.
It's weak theory. It's weak. Weak referencing on my part. But there was a essay that was reading about like the two faces meeting one another and that being a moment of recognition of the other. It feels vaguely Butlerian, but it made me think a lot about surfaces in your sculptural work, and also surfaces in general, and how this, like, again, like this idea of like an exterior and an interior can be challenged through different processes of movement and art making. And yesterday we were sort of talking about it, and you talked about folds, and you talked about other ways of these surfaces relating to one another and actually sort of fucking up that idea of an interior and exterior. So I wanted to ask just about that idea of surfaces inhabiting this some kind of relation, and what it means for skin or flesh to touch the material object. I guess kind of related to the way that Judith Butler describes the body as being a social phenomenon. And by that they specify that it's through its surfaces being exposed, its vulnerability to others and its vulnerability to like that which surrounds it being evident. Something about surfaces and vulnerability. I'm just gonna like throw it with that.
This is funny because as I'm thinking about your questions out of the corner of my eye, I'm like seeing these works go by, and I'm like, oh wait, I could answer it in relation to this one. And I'm like, okay, wait, okay, no, I could answer it in relation to this one. So maybe the first way I want to talk about this is actually to think about the surfaces of objects themselves, not even including like the presence of human bodies. As you've seen, a lot of the surfaces of my work are quite labor intensive or time intensive, or in some way are like the trace of some kind of repeated action, like millions of tiny nails, or like colored in with a ballpoint pen, or I use a lot of colored pencil, etc. So in some sense, yes, we're thinking about like a labor of the exterior. But even though we might, when we talk about a surface, we sort of immediately think about an outside, objects and bodies, but let's say objects also have, this is actually a good example, a lot of other surfaces that are not on the outside. So like that piece that went by is really purely about thinking about folding. So that's these three really, really, really long strips, and then all that you're seeing is the little bits of the edge, it's all folded in there. And so often sculpturally I'm trying to figure out, this is ballpoint pen, like how do you make an object that asks you to think about the surface, but then to think about the surface of the sides you can't see, the sides that face the wall, or the sides that face like the other part of it, it's stacked or it's folded, or that face the floor, and maybe like touch the wall or touch each other, and that those like dark spaces where the surface is not visible on the outside, that feels really important to me, because it's an object that is both there for you to see it, but also will not give its entirety to you. Like it's an object, maybe it's introverted, or it never fully makes itself known entirely, which to me sort of correlates with a request for a type of viewing that is more like a witnessing of something that's happening kind of on its own accord without you, than like being performed for. So there's that, and then, human bodies sort of enter into these object situations. The objects always come first, like I make them first. I literally sort of like don't know what they're for, and then I work with dancers or I work with myself and I do a lot of improvisation like with them to sort of figure out what happens. But the points at which our like hands and feet and other parts of our bodies like actually meet the object are like sort of the central focus of the performances. So those points of touch, and the way that they, make requests of our bodies, allow us to like see or think about bodies in ways that are perhaps not how we generally do.
And I think that, that like asking questions of bodies and like what does it mean for them to be in proximity to, I think about proximity a lot, because I remember reading, when I was doing my like curatorial masters, reading this like fucking god awful essay by some like museum studies person, and it was all about like proximity between these like existing museological objects, and I was just like, that was the moment I was like, okay, I'm not going to work somewhere with a collection. But there is something interesting about proximity and objects where, again, this is just turning into like a Sedgwick like fanboy convention, but that's fine, I think. But you know, there's this really concise quote by her, which she's talking about besideness and like, you know, parataxis, this putting things together next to one another so that they can reveal things about each other. And she says, any child knows who shared a bed with siblings that beside comprises a wide range of desiring, identifying, representing, repelling, paralleling, differentiating, rivaling, leaning, twisting, mimicking, withdrawing, attracting, aggressing, warping, and other relations. And I think like the very formal elements of where the performance and the sculpture meet one another is like super, super interesting in how it reveals these relatively simple object positions can actually speak to sort of much bigger questions. And yeah, just to return to that like idea of like insideness and outsideness, there's a really interesting book called I'm trying to translate it from Spanish to French to English, and I don't know what it's like, sodomized anal politics, but it's about anal politics. But there's a really amazing section where it theorizes that the fist is this sort of within like sort of gay sexual culture and queer cultural production more widely, the fist is this sort of like recuperative object because it actually has changed that dynamic of like exteriors and interiors in terms of how it moves through people's bodies. And I think with the title of the show that we're in now, I Can Fit a Fist in My Mouth, everyone is just so preoccupied with this like idea of a fist in someone's mouth and like what that means. But it says, you know, the tightened fist, normally defined as a gesture of aggression and menace, here becomes redefined as an instrument of affection. The pleasure of colonizing with your hand the interior of another man and to sense his heartbeats supposes a certain expertise and a great responsibility. And I think there's like ways that limbs and body parts necessarily become part of the vocabulary that you're working in with these sculptures, but it feels like it opens up opportunities for them to exist in different ways and like expansive ways rather than the violence associated with a fist, for example. Does that feel like rings in relation to your practice?
Yeah, definitely. How do I want to answer this? One of the ways that my work sometimes gets sort of like umbrellaed is under the idea of sort of like queer abstraction or something like this. Which, okay, whatever, but I get a little frustrated with the way that the idea of queerness is so focused on the human and on like sexual relations with other people. Not that those aren't important, but I'm interested in a version of queerness that's much more like expanding of the boundaries of the erotic, like into the world of things, of objects, both in the form of like, you know, sort of like erotic relationships with physical things, but also, I think, in the question of objectification, like what are the sort of both risks and pleasures of feeling like an object or allowing oneself to be treated like an object, and the kind of bonds of trust and vulnerability that are part of that.
and there's like an emancipation that can come from, like, I think one of the references I sent was a thesis written by Linda Stupart, which is Becoming Object, and it sort of talks about the like emancipation that can come with becoming an object, because it allows you to evade institutional subjectivities. And, you know, there's a way that like subjectivity can be reified and can be hierarchized and can be archived in a way and like understood, which is like what we're seeing in our political system and what we're seeing on, you know, these campuses all over the US, where the people on behalf of the university that are trying to stop students from rightly occupying and demanding divestment, the people that the universities are sending, the people that are representative of the institutions, it's people of color, it's queer people, there's, you know, trans members of the faculty who have become like the like handmaidens for this really sort of violent institutional aggression. Like, you know, like our fucking Prime Minister is Rishi Sunak, like maybe our next Prime Minister is going to be someone. There's 100 different ways that I could get angry and talk about these things, but yeah, it feels like as a queer person that importance of evasion feels more and more pertinent, I think.
I mean, it's really complicated because, you know, every person who's like in some way part of any marginalized group, or like I would say almost like any person who's like moving through the world as a woman, like understands the like dehumanization of being treated like an object, right? Like that's a very real form of violence that can be expressed in very subtle ways or can be expressed in like catastrophic ways. Which, of course, the response to that is like, you know, treat me like a human being. But I think beyond that demand, right, correct demand, there are some questions to ask about the hierarchy of, a hierarchy that places always the human over the thing, you know, human, animal, things. The earth is like somewhere down here. And the, you know, the effects of that kind of hierarchy. So when we say, okay, I'm going to identify in certain consensual situations with the position of the object, and I'm going to try to either like flatten that hierarchy or reverse that hierarchy in some way, even kind of like as a thought experiment. So that's what I feel like I'm doing a lot in the studio, and that's, you know, to go back to this thing about sculptures and props, you know, it's really important to me that I'm not making performance that then I'm figuring out what we need and making the object that meets that need. It's that the objects are making requests. They have needs. They're making requests of us, even if they're originating in me. It's like I don't fully know them. And then they're asking for stuff. That's actually a really good example. Like I didn't know that this was what this was for before I, you know, as I made it or even right after I made it. Maybe this would actually be a nice moment to say the conditions under which we first met, which I was doing a show. This was right before COVID, 2019. I was doing a show in the U.S., but like on the other side of the U.S. from where I live, and so I had made all these sculptures. There was, I forget how many, but like 15 sculptures. Those photos that are in the big warehouse space. It's all those things. And I had this teeny tiny little studio back then, and so I begged and pleaded to the institution, listen, like, I need to put these things in a space that can hold them all for even just like 3 days so that I can meet them all and see how they talk to each other and like what the space between them is like, and like think about this install, but also work with dancers and like try to figure out what the performance is all about. And amazingly, they were like, okay, we're going to rent this warehouse for like a week in Red Hook. And so everything was, I put down all these tarps because it was filthy. And
so on like my third day, for the first time ever in the US, in New York, I was heading out to Red Hook, Brooklyn, which was an experience.
A subway adventure. Yeah, it's like the very edge of Brooklyn, which is like an hour from where my studio even was there. Anyway, so that's where we met, and it was in this moment that in some ways I'm always like, this feels like an extra weird step that like other artists don't seem to need, but this is an important part of making this whole thing work. So you got to meet me there, which was good.
Yeah, and I thought you were such a big shot with your massive studio. But no, there
It was
was
temporary.
yeah, yeah, but it was kind of amazing to get a sense of like what, because you were it was the Portland, the Pika. Do people call it Pika?
They call it pica.
Pica. Okay, I'm just making up abbreviations, but yeah, it was like really interesting to get a sense of this exhibition that was going to happen on like the other side of a continent. I have to call the US a continent because it is it's so big. But it was really incredible to like be at that stage of fucking around and finding out, and the privilege of getting to have a peek at that. So thank you. I've just got like one more question, and then I can take questions from the audience, if there are any, which I'm sure there will be. But yeah, I just like wanted to finish with something that we both talked about, which I think we're both at the very beginning of like understanding or like beginning to think about this, and it's something that like piqued my interest recently, that I'm like, okay, that's something I need to read more on, and I need to do some homework on. But we were talking yesterday about this like huge sort of lineage of sexual objects in queer history, which kind of emerged from like talking about like fists, and the fact that like butt plugs were actually developed at the same time as prosthesis, and like the but I mean, butt plugs have always existed, just to be clear. It's very important, we all know that. But the sort of like mass production of butt plugs in this way was paralleled with the production of the development of prosthetics following World War I and World War II. You had this like generation of young men who had lost hands and arms and limbs, but also their genitals, and the like I wrote his name but I've lost it. It's a French doctor who I can add the name to the transcript.
I hope it like goes like this on the top.
Yeah. He was sort of like making this link between the penis and the hand, and it was just like a really interesting way to think about like prosthetics and the possibilities of the human body, and what like an idea of prosthesis might evoke in a sculptural practice, and not in a way where prosthesis is a direct replacement for a body part, but in a way where it actually just acts differently, it functions differently, and it becomes like a expansive possibility for ways of being and moving and interacting. In the same way that like the role of like fist fucking in this essay is described as not a replacement for the penis, it's like an expansion. What are the other ways that bodies might be expansively imagined with this idea of prosthesis?
I just want to give an example of one of the places where I often think about this, which is when I'm driving. Driving's, what can possibly be interesting to say about driving? But you know how when you drive, you become physically identified with the outline of your car? That's why it's so scary if someone just like hits your car with their hand, because you are having like a bodily response to that, because in a virtual sense, the boundaries of your body have extended to the size of whatever vehicle you're in. I find that to be incredibly interesting. I mean, that's why we like can drive, but that's also why our relationships with prosthetics of many kinds, whether they have to do with disability or pleasure or whatever, it's not, it's not that there's a body and then there's this thing, but that actually what we think of as comprising the body becomes like expanded or changed in those moments. And so there's like, maybe this is a leap, but the ways that all bodies, whether they're using prostheses or not, have both real and virtual capacities, or like real or virtual aspects to their movement through the world or to their being. Prostheses make that virtual component more make it apparent in these moments when you realize that your body really doesn't actually end where it ends. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's some kind of like rejection of bodies or embodiment or like a fantasy about being a brain in a jar or something like this. It's just a dedication to a mode of embodiment that includes a very like hazy boundary between us and things. Yeah.
No, I think that like idea of extending the limits, like boundaries of what your body's constituted by, it reminds me of Charlie Prodger's film work. I don't know if you'll be familiar, but Charlie was someone who won the Turner Prize. Yeah. Yes, did win. Yeah, I was happy that they won. But yeah, won the Turner Prize a few years ago, and in the typical like, just like it was announced a few days ago, and Jaslyn Kaur's been like christened the Iron Brew artist because she uses like Iron Brew. And the year that Charlie was nominated, it was like the iPhone artist, like iPhone filmmaker. And there was a really interesting interview with Charlie talking about like this like, there's this fetishization of like 60mm and analog film techniques. And Charlie was there making incredible film work with an iPhone, but was talking about the bodiliness and like that being a prosthesis, and like the iPhone being an extension of their own body, and actually like an iPhone moves and wobbles when you're breathing, and it like picks up when you're like stumbling or shaking, and it's just as bodily and material as analog film in some ways, or it has the potential to be, I guess. But yeah.
Have we talked about this piece I made last year about the iPhone screen?
No.
Wait, this is crazy. This is a little quick digression. Okay. I was on the train, like the train that goes up and down New York State, and so somebody was on their phone, and then the sun was coming in, and it was hitting their screen, and then it was like bonking it up to the ceiling, so there was this like lit up thing, moving around.
A fairy.
A fairy, yes. But so clear that you could like see the thumbs moving. It was so beautiful. So I videoed it, and then I worked with the designer and basically figured out how to replicate it. So I made a piece where like it's bouncing around, but it's not the recording. We actually like made new footage and then put it into Blender and like shone a light on it. Anyhow, and I was thinking about all of this stuff, how, I guess similar to the example of cars, like, what can we possibly like say about our iPhones that's like, but then at the same time, I feel like even in these very, I don't know, kind of like impoverished feeling cultural places. Like I also have an obsession with parking lots that I'm trying to work on something for. That you can find these really beautiful like ways into questions that are actually really interesting around, where our bodies start and end, the like private introverted space of like your relationship with your screen in bed, and the like sensuality of the touch on the screen, like seeing her thumbs moving. Like anyway, it just was all there. It was really beautiful.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
It's like when you see your thumbprints on your phone, or I never clean my phone screen, so maybe this is why I think about it, but I remember like seeing a really smudgy, disgusting phone screen that was mine with History of Touches by Bjork on the like Spotify app. And I was like, this is my History of Touches. Thank you so much for giving us such an insight